Do not go gentle into that good night. Old age should burn and rave at close of day. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Though wise men at their end know dark is right, because their words had forked no lightning, they do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light.
Aggression in poker is like salt in your food. Not enough of it and the food is bland and forgettable. Too much of it and the meal is spoiled. You could say that the principal challenge in poker is to delicately tightrope the line between over and under aggression, and in this video we'll be exploring this idea not in the obvious context of a triple barrel all-in, but rather using a more nuanced example which focuses on the precarious balance between aggression and its counterpart risk. So in this hand, Daniel opens it up on the button with aces, Doug calls with jack deuce of spades, and the flop comes trip nines. Doug checks and Daniel continues with a tiny 20% pot bet. Both of these plays appear to be generally fine, although the solver favors a half pot sizing in Daniel's shoes. This is a board that heavily favors the pre-flop aggressor because he has the advantage in all of the overpairs, as Doug is likely 3-betting most of his pocket pairs pre-flop. However, interestingly, we see that the solver is doing a significant amount of checking as well in Daniel's shoes, which is likely a function of the width of the player's ranges. Right, in a 6-max game between the button and the big blind in a single raise pot, the in-position player is basically going to be range betting 100% of the time on most trip boards. However, here, given that Daniel's range has so much trash in it, and given that Doug actually has a proportional advantage in 9x combos, it makes sense that even with the button's significant range advantage, the solver will do some amount of checking. So Doug raises it a bit over 80% of pot, and we do see that the solver is raising with this specific combo with relatively moderate frequency. So how is the solver constructing its raising range here? Well, first we should note that the solver is doing a good bit of raising overall against this tiny bet. Doug should have a significant portion of quads here that are incentivized to accelerate growing the pot. He should also have some full houses that want to raise, primarily for protection, as evidenced by the fact that the raising frequency increases as we go lower in rank, as these weaker full houses are more vulnerable to overcards that may appear on the turn or river. And finally, we see a sprinkling of bluffs mixed in as well. For example, some of the stronger ace highs are bluffing, which are Doug's best draws to full houses, and they also block much of Daniel's calling range. And we also see bluffs mixed in at a lower frequency across a number of these trash combos, with the solver playing more aggressively with backdoor equity. It appears that the solver prefers allocating raises to hands with stronger unblockers to Daniel's autofolds. When we brush the unmade hands with the highest unblocker scores, we see that the solver is raising nearly 29% of these combos, which all contain one high card and one low card. Whereas when we focus on the same class with the lowest unblocker scores, we see the raising frequency drop to around 7%. These hands consist primarily of suited and unsuited connectors that will have a tough time calling any raise. However, even some of these combos are raising at a low frequency, and there aren't really many obvious bluff raise candidates in Doug's range. Right, on most flops, the solver will prioritize allocating bluffs to hands with draw equity. However, in situations such as this one, where you don't have any standard draws, but you need additional bluffs to balance your value combos, the solver will often mix in its bluffs across a large group of similarly mediocre bluffing candidates at a low frequency to avoid over-bluffing. And so Doug, who seems to have a particular knack for finding obscure bluffs, finds one here with his jack high. And then Daniel calls with his aces, which we see is the standard play, as the solver is doing very little 3-betting here, as most of his strong value combos do not need protection on this board. The turn is the deuce of clubs, and Doug barrels with around a third pot bet, which we see is the standard play with Doug's weaker full houses. As mentioned on the flop, the solver is firing with greater frequency with these lower full houses that have a higher risk of being outdrawn by overcards on the river. However, we see that firing this same bet with all full houses results in less than 1% of EV regret, so if Doug wanted to simplify here and bet all of these combos at some frequency, it would likely be okay. The solver also mixes in a larger full pot bet with its quads to accelerate the growth of the pot, and then it balances this larger betting range with a number of bluffs, particularly with combos that block 9x and stronger full houses. And similar to the flop, we see that the solver is again simply calling with most of its range in Daniel's shoes, as the need for protection has decreased further with only one card to come, and the button also possesses the ability to control the betting action in position on the final street. The river is the 8 of diamonds, and Doug triple barrels with another small 30% pot bet. Given that Doug opted to use a smaller sizing on the turn, whereas a majority of Doug's quads used a larger sizing, most of Doug's river range is comprised primarily of a bunch of good but not so great hands, namely middle to low full houses, which warrant a smaller bet size. This smallish river bet by the out-of-position player, which some may refer to as a block bet or a preemptive bet, will often be the ideal sizing for a middling hand such as the one Doug is holding, that is just slightly ahead of most of villain's range. The primary function of this type of bet is for the out-of-position player to leverage the initiative by setting the price to continue in such a way that the bet may be called by some weaker hands in villain's range that would have otherwise checked behind, and it also, at the same time, preempts certain other portions of the in-position player's range from betting larger when checked too. These preempted hands of the in-position player will generally include slightly stronger value combos and weaker bluffs that do not have an incentive to play for a huge pot and therefore will be deterred from raising when facing a bet, and this in turn affords the out-of-position player's middling hands the ability to cheaply see a showdown. However, obviously this type of play will only work if your block betting range is balanced overall. Right, if Doug only block bet with middling strength hands, Daniel would be able to punish him by ramping up his raising frequency. So how is the solver constructing its block bet range to balance against these middling hands? Well, although most of Doug's quads opted for the larger sizing on the turn, a not insignificant portion of his quads should have utilized this smaller sizing, particularly when holding a lower kicker, which unblocked a significant portion of Daniel's raising range to small bets. And by overlapping its nuttish holdings with this smaller size, the big blind is able to arrive at the river with a balanced range, which protects its weaker value combos from being punished by the button with raises. And then we also see the solver round out its block betting range by including some bluffs, again apparently favoring hands with stronger unblocker scores, which are being bet nearly 90% of the time, whereas the hands with the lowest unblocker scores, primarily consisting of the Jack-10 combos, are only being bet at around 50% of the time as they block Daniel's autofolds, particularly when holding the club, which blocks Daniel's missed flush draws. These preemptive bluffs serve the dual purposes of both potentially winning the pot against Daniel's folding range, as well as increasing the EV of Doug's value combos by forcing Daniel to expand his bluff catching range to include marginal hands such as ace high, given the great odds laid. And Daniel decides to simply call behind. So what is the basis for simply calling and not raising here with the second nuts? Well, in my last video on this grudge match, we discussed how thin value betting in position on the river exposes you to the risk of getting check raised, and this same dilemma applies in a thin raising spot such as this one. If Daniel raises here and Doug 3-bets, Doug's range would likely consist of 9x and some bluffs, and against that range, all of Daniel's stronger full houses become essentially equivalent bluff catchers, with the only thing differentiating them being blockers, meaning that some of Daniel's aces would in theory need to fold to a raise. And so the benefit of raising and getting some of Doug's thin value hands to call needs to be weighed against the risk of Doug shoving and Daniel losing, either by folding or calling and being shown quads. And of course, Daniel has no incentive to raise against Doug's bluffs. Given these considerations, Daniel's call is good from a GTO perspective, at least in isolation. We see that although the solver is opting to raise most of the button's stronger full houses, the EVs of calling and raising are virtually the same for aces, likely because the aces block many of Doug's best bluff catchers. That being said, just because Daniel's play appears to be GTO in this particular instance, it doesn't mean that his overall strategy was GTO in a broader sense. In fact, you could view this hand as a microcosm of a larger theme that appeared to be manifesting at the time, where Doug regularly would seize the initiative and tread more often along aggressive branches of the game tree, whereas Daniel appeared to play more passively overall, perhaps in an attempt to use Doug's aggression against him. From Doug's perspective in this hand, he used aggression to triple barrel, culminating with a block bet on the river, which at the end of the day may have actually saved him some chips. Right through taking the initiative, he was able to set a relatively low price on the turn and river, whereas I think many others would have simply checked to try to cheaply get to showdown, which undoubtedly would have resulted in Daniel betting larger. In that way, although counterintuitive, you could view Doug's play here as an example of effectively using aggression in a defensive manner. And from Daniel's perspective, it seemed that at the time when this hand was played, the general consensus was that Daniel had been playing quite well overall, although he seemed to lean more towards passive branches of the game tree, particularly by laying traps and using smaller sizings. And although I've only seen highlights of these matches, I would tend to agree with his assessment, and I would speculate that if you ran all of Daniel's hands through a solver, most of his lines would not have resulted in significant EV loss compared to the GTO solutions. However, while I personally advocate prioritizing a focus on EV over precise GTO frequencies, we should keep in mind that the EVs generated by the solver are based on the assumption that both players are following the frequencies indicated in the solution, and if one player is not, the expected values of his actions can be diminished. In other words, it's possible for someone to play 100% solver-approved lines but still be very exploitable over the long run. Right, since GTO strategies are typically very mixed, especially when ranges are wider, you'll often have the flexibility to utilize a variety of different lines and still remain within the realm of GTO when analyzing single hands in isolation. However, if we ignore frequencies completely and lean too heavily into passive or aggressive branches of the game tree, we run the risk of being structurally exploitable in the long run against an adept opponent, even if we're using 100% solver-approved lines. For example, many river bluffs will have 0 EV, so if you decide to never fire them, in theory you won't lose an expectation against a GTO opponent. However, in reality, the primary value of bluffs don't really come from your opponent folding. Instead, they come from forcing your opponent to expand his calling range, which in turn increases the expectation of your value hands. And we should also keep in mind that it's possible to essentially manipulate EV loss by playing passively, since Nash equilibrium strategies often contain passive lines, even with nuttish hands, and EV loss tends to grow in correlation to the size of the pot. For example, EV losses are typically amplified in 3-bet pots compared to single raise pots, because bet and pot sizes tend to be much bigger in 3-bet pots. So in other words, a player can actually artificially lower his EV losses by deliberately keeping pots small, whereas mistakes generally will not be punished as severely. And this is why, if you're focusing on EV as a metric to gauge the exploitability of your play, it's important to also secondarily track your overall aggression as well, not necessarily on a hand-by-hand basis, but rather on an aggregated basis across many hands. And you can do this either by using a HUD or by using a tool such as Simple Poker's GTO Trainer, which is what I personally use. For example, I'm naturally a very risk-averse person, so my internal inertia tends to push me towards passive branches of the game tree. So when I'm studying solver solutions, one of my primary goals is always to find spots that I can play as aggressively as possible while minimizing EV loss. In fact, if I had to choose between erring on the side of being overly aggressive or overly passive, for me, I would 100% choose being overly aggressive, since in poker, aggression can be such an incredibly powerful, multifaceted tool. Right, aggression gives you the opportunity to win the pot with your bluffs when you're behind. It can push your opponent off their equity when they otherwise might be able to draw ahead. And as mentioned, it also forces your opponent to expand his calling range, thereby allowing you to get additional value with your stronger hands. However, when you play passively, even when solver approved, you potentially miss out on some of these benefits. Additionally, as we witnessed in this hand, when you take the initiative by playing aggressively, you generally will have a more clairvoyant sense of where you are in the game tree, because you'll usually have a better idea of whether you're playing for value, protection, or as a bluff, whereas when you take a bluff catching line, it will often be more difficult to navigate and know where you're at unless you're slow playing the absolute nuts. Now, none of this is to say that based on this isolated hand, that Daniel was playing overly passive as a general matter. Perhaps he randomized here and rolled low, or perhaps he thought Doug's block betting range was trap heavy and was attempting to exploit. However, shortly after this session, it appeared that Daniel ramped up his aggression a bit, particularly by using larger bet sizes, which also coincided with him winning more sessions. Perhaps this shift in results was merely a matter of variance coming back around. However, one thing that I think most people can agree with is that as a general matter, it is much more difficult to play against someone that's aggressive compared to someone that's passive. And at the halfway point in this challenge, it'll be interesting to see how Daniel's play progresses, and whether he will try to keep pots small to avoid further losses, or if he will instead throw caution to the wind and embrace variance by continuing to ramp up his aggression in an all-out effort to seize the victory from the jaws of defeat. So that's the video for today. Thanks for watching, and until next time, stay balanced.